My name is David Shirley, and I serve as Director of Missions for the Beaver Dam Baptist Association over in Oconee County in South Carolina. A dear friend of mine is Pastor Brian Buckner, who asked me to share just a few words of encouragement with you today. I love pastors. I served as a pastor for 30 plus years, and now I serve as a Director of Missions. And one of the joys of my life is encouraging pastors. Pastoring a church today is challenging. It's extremely challenging. You have to deal with the demon deacons sometimes. You have to deal with the matriarchs and the patriarchs in churches whose mama and papas founded the church. And this is just the way we do it here, preacher. And oftentimes I have encountered pastors who are extremely discouraged. And so I just want to share a word of encouragement with you today, just a brief word. I want you to understand, men, that if God has called you into ministry, you have the highest possible calling that a man could have. In fact, Mark Lowry says that a pastor, a minister, a God-called man would have to step down to become president of the United States. You have an extremely high calling. You have the highest calling possible. So think about that. O.S. Hawkins says there were days in his ministry, there were times in his ministry when the call of God upon his life was the only thing that kept him going. But think about it, the God who spoke the world into existence, the God who created everything, called you. God called you. And you see, oftentimes when we go through the challenges of being a pastor, there's days where it seems as though folks want to rob us of the joy that's really ours within. I think of Junior Hill, that great evangelist. Junior Hill says in every church there's different types of people. He says in every church there's reprobates, those that are just lost, that know nothing about God. He said in every church there are the rebukers, those that seem like it's their calling just to constantly rebuke and chastise and poke and prod. He said in every church there's reprobates and rebukers, but he also says in every church there are refreshers, encouragers, those that have the spirit, the beauty, and the loveliness of Christ. And so I want you to understand that when the rebukers and when those come against you that try to rob you of your joy, I want you to understand, remember your calling. You have a calling, the highest calling possible. I think about the words we read in John chapter 15. In verse 16, it says, Jesus said, "You did not choose me, but I chose you," now listen, "and appointed you that you should go forth and bear fruit." Jesus said, I chose you so that you can go forth and bear fruit. I chose you. I appointed you. In Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 7, Paul says, I became a minister according to the gift of the grace of God given to me by the effective working of his power. Think about those two passages. You have a special calling and a special gift to perform the work of the ministry. God called you, men. God called you. I love that. There's probably, when it comes to a minister of the gospel, no more nobler words that can be said of a man of God than what was said of David. When it was said of David in Acts chapter 13 that David served God's purpose and then he fell asleep. David served God's purpose. God called you, men. He blessed you, he called you, he gifted you, he appointed you. As he told Jeremiah, he sanctified you, he set you apart. God called you, not the deacons, not the patriarchs and the matriarchs. God called you and appointed you to this position. And there's nothing that more could be said of us than we served God's purpose. And then we fell asleep. Wow. It's awesome to think about God's call. God calls and God gifts. You've all heard it said before, God doesn't call the equipped and the gifted oftentimes. He calls men and then he equips and gifts them himself. So I trust that those words would be important to you and cherished by you, but I want you to understand there's something supernatural about the God called pastor. There's something supernatural about the God called pastor. You have a tremendous responsibility. You will have a tremendous accountability, but there's something special about the God called pastor. Wow. You see, our purpose is to serve God, and we're to live as men sent. As we're to live as men. John chapter 1 and verse 6 says, there was a man sent forth from God whose name was John. Listen, there was a man sent forth from God whose name was John. You and I are to live as sent men. Sent men, sent from God. And sometimes God sends us to the challenging places. Sometimes God sends us to the difficult places. Sometimes God sends us to do the hard stuff. But you see, we're to live as sent men. Wow. One last thought. I want you to understand that the ministry you have, men, is a received ministry from God. I think there's two types of ministry. There is a received ministry, and then there is an achieved ministry. Two very different types of ministries. It's in Acts chapter 20 and verse 24. Listen to these words. None of these things move me, nor do I count my life dear to myself, so that I may finish my race with joy. And listen to what he said. And the ministry which I received from the Lord. There is a received ministry. Your ministry, men, you were called by God. Your ministry belongs to the Lord. You receive that from God. Oftentimes, and we've all made this mistake, we talk about my ministry, my ministry, my ministry. You see, it's His ministry. It's a received ministry. It becomes your ministry when you begin to look at ministry as an achieved ministry. What I've done. There's a big difference there. There's a difference. You see, an achieved ministry, look at what I've done. I've achieved this. An achieved ministry seeks the applause of men. But a received ministry seeks the applause of God. Men, I want you to understand that you have an audience of one. You have an audience of one. You don't have to please all the deacons. You don't have to please the folks that say Mama and Papa started the church. You only have to please one. And my desire, and when I've pastored and when I've preached for 30 plus years, my desire is when the lights are turned out in the church and the doors are locked, my only desire every Sunday and every Wednesday and every day that I served, my only desire was that there was a smile on God's face and that He was pleased with what took place that day. Men, I love you. I pray for you. I thank God for you. I want to be an Onesiphorus to you, an encourager to you. But listen, on those days when it gets tough, you remember there's nothing that can touch the call of God upon your life. It is a supernatural, divine call. The God of the universe called you, and He gave you a ministry, a received ministry. You're to live as sent men. My name is David, and I was sent forth from God. Put your name there. You're sent forth from God to fulfill His purpose. May it be said of us, just like it was said of David, that he achieved his purpose, he fulfilled his purpose, and then he fell asleep. I love you, men. God bless you. Amen.